Okay, I want to talk about a really interesting and often overlooked psychological point in the second essay of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, particularly in sections 20 and 22 and pages 90 to 92 in your text. And here he comes back to the theme of the death of God and the death of Christian values. But in light of this discussion he's been having about bad conscience and guilt, remember, bad conscience results from our aggressive instincts turned inward. Man is a violent creature. Human beings are violent and aggressive by nature. And when we enter into society, we can no longer discharge those, so we turn them back on ourselves, and therefore, voila, we have a conscience and bad guilt, or bad conscience. Now, Nietzsche plays with this idea a little bit and says, so yes, we have bad conscience, that's these aggressive instincts turned in on ourselves, that becomes projected outward against a God. We have guilt before the God, or guilt before the holy, or guilt before the sacred. God is projected as a judge, as a kind of superego in the Freudian sense, as a creditor, and we're in debt to the creditor. So we have a kind of explanation of why and to whom we feel this torture and why we need to torture our conscience, or torture ourselves through conscience, okay? And so this idea of, and follow me for a second here, with this indebtedness to God comes this idea of blood sacrifice, human or animal, to appease the deity. Now, this is a concept not foreign to Christianity or to Judaism as well. If you read Leviticus, for example, I think it's chapter 6, where it goes through the priests, the Jewish priests in the time of the Old Testament were pretty much like butchers. They would have to kill animals, especially on Yom Kippur, to appease the deity. And this is cross-cultural. And when we get to René Girard, we'll see he talks in much more detail about the cross-cultural significance in animal or blood sacrifice in religion, how the altar is central in religion. Anyway, so we have guilt before God, and the only thing that seems to relieve this guilt before God is, again, the cathartic blood sacrifice, the bloodletting, the slaying of blood, the sacrifice of an animal or a human, the sacrifice of life. Now, in Christianity, Nietzsche thinks, comes up with this genius idea, and he says this, I think, on 92. Suddenly we stand before the paradoxical and horrifying expedient that afforded temporary relief for tormented humanity. That stroke of genius on the part of Christianity. God himself sacrifices himself for the guilt of mankind. God himself makes payment to himself. God is the only being who can redeem man from what has become unredeemable for man himself. The creditor sacrifices himself for the debtor out of love. Can one credit that? Out of love for his debtor. The genius of Christianity is that it's figured out a way to end this feeling of guilt before God, namely God comes down, sacrifices himself, or God sends his son to be sacrificed. God pays the debt to himself. For example, in the first epistle of John, 2:2, it says, if anyone sins, this is the second chapter in the beginning, 2:1, if anyone sins, I write this so you don't sin, but if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. He, Jesus, is the propitiation for our sins. Not of our sins only, but the sins of the whole world. What does that mean? It means Christ's blood appeases the wrath of God, or sets things right. And thus, we don't have to keep doing that anymore. We don't have to do two things. We don't have to feel guilty, and we don't have to we don't have to continually sacrifice anymore. That's why animal sacrifice is largely done away with. Okay, now, what do you do with this whole system, so to speak, of Western, that's arose in the West, in Western values, but has this darker, violent nature behind it in bad conscience and guilt? Well, once the death of God comes, the problem is, it seems like it would be an advance. It seems like finally we're delivered from all this feeling of guilt, and we're delivered from our conscience. And Nietzsche says, the irresistible decline of faith, he says this on 90 at the bottom, decline of faith in the Christian God, there is now a considerable decline in man's feeling of guilt, it would seem. Indeed, the prospect cannot be dismissed that the complete and definitive victory of atheism might free mankind of this whole feeling of guilty indebtedness toward its origin, its causa prima. Atheism and a kind of second innocence belong together, kind of going back to the Garden of Eden. However, Nietzsche says that's not what happens. In fact, the opposite happens. It's not as though we can just get rid of this feeling of guilt. This is, thousands of years of evolutionary history, this feeling of guilt and bad conscience. So once the Christian values collapse, the guilt starts to build up. and it has no place to discharge itself. Nobody's going and sacrificing animals now again. Maybe they're getting more violent, but Nietzsche thinks we're going to start torturing ourselves again. And I think this is an interesting explanation, among others, why Nietzsche might argue, he doesn't use this terminology, but might argue something like there's a rise in hopelessness, or a rise, we could say, in depression. Freud had this idea, very influenced by Nietzsche, had this idea that depression was nothing more than radical feelings of guilt and self-torture. And it's interesting to think about. I'm not saying this is the reason. There's a lot of psychological science that obviously disagrees with this, but it's something that there's clearly a correlation between the death of God and the rise in kind of hopelessness or meaninglessness, or what we might even call something like depression, where you just think, but it's not just because the highest value has devalued itself. It's because the highest value has devalued itself. We don't find a why anymore. Remember, if we have a why, we can endure anyhow. But now we also have nowhere and no place to discharge our guilt. We have no system. We have no sacrificial system in the metaphorical sense to discharge that guilt. And that's what Christianity and even primitive religion provided for us.